Kia ora, whakarowhalahi atu, halo augeta, iorana, kamna Māori, malolelei, nisambuli minaka, aloha talofa. Warm Pacific greetings. Welcome to Topic 2 of the Pacific Research Guidelines learning module developed by our very own AUT's Moana Roa Pacific Research Network. In this module, we'll introduce you to the Pacific Research Movement, past, present and future. Before we move into the learning module, I just want to share with you a Kiribati proverb, just to set the intention and to welcome you into this safe space for exploration and learning around Pacific research. Te reirei bon te matau ai kokona. Education is a magic hook and a key to knowledge, and I hope the content throughout all of your modules hooks you into your learning to support your engagement in Pacific research. As we designed the research guidelines, one of our Moana Roa members shared in her talanoa, research should contribute to the spiritual, mental, physical and social well-being of individuals, families and communities, close quote. Topic 2 will provide you an introduction to the Pacific research movement to support you gaining familiarity with the Pacific context in Aotearoa, to understand the historical and cultural foundations of Pacific research, to explore future directions and opportunities, and to apply knowledge to real-world contexts. We hope this topic sheds light on the vast richness of the Pacific and how we might advance and promote Pacific research. Welcome. This topic is as vast as the oceanic region itself, and there are many rich resources that can support you to keep growing your learning. What we're sharing here is a small, carefully curated starting point to help introduce you to the topic and open up some pathways for deeper engagement. You may notice that our own AUT Vice-Chancellor, Toi Sulusulu, Damon Salesa, features among these readings. He is one of the leading scholars in the field of Pacific history, and his work offers an important entry point into understanding the depth, the complexity, and the significance of Pacific thought and historical movement across time and place. We also hope this encourages you to seek out other exceptional Pacific scholars, educators and staff here at AUT. One of the most meaningful ways to deepen your understanding of the Pacific research movement is through relationships, through conversations, shared learning and ongoing connection across our institution. For this topic, you'll begin with a self-assessment followed by an Oceania geography quiz. These activities are designed to help you reflect on your current understanding and build a stronger sense of place, connection and context. Alongside this, we've included a small set of suggested readings to support your learning more deeply. Together, these readings offer valuable perspectives on Pacific histories, identities and ways of understanding the region. We have also suggested a couple of videos that may be helpful as you move through this topic. These are The Peopling of the Pacific, The Last Great Human Expansion, and the Aotearoa History Show episode on New Zealand's Pacific Empire from RNZ. These resources offer further insight in ways that are engaging and accessible. We will then conclude with a set of reflective questions to help you pause and think about what this learning is opening up for you. And please feel free to pause this video at any point as you work through these resources. You might also like to have your reflective journal nearby so you can take notes and capture ideas and document your learning as you go. As mentioned in Topic 1, a key part of these learning modules is positionality and reflexivity. These ideas remain central as we move through the course, and you'll continue to be invited to reflect on how each topic connects with you, your own experiences, and the way that this learning can inform your research, teaching and learning and supervision practices. We begin Topic 2 with a self-assessment focused on your familiarity with the Pacific and Pacific history. This is an opportunity to pause, take stock of where you are, and notice what you already carry, as well as what you may still be growing in your understanding. As you work through the self-assessment questions, please feel free to pause the video and write your responses in your journal. Take your time with this. The aim is to reflect honestly and thoughtfully on your current knowledge and experiences. First, rate your current knowledge or familiarity with the Pacific and Pacific history on a scale from 1 to 10. At 1, you might think of yourself as a seed, a novice learner at the beginning of a learning journey, and at 10, you might think of yourself as a mature fruiting tree, a source of knowledge with deep roots and much to share. Then consider this question in your research, teaching and learning and supervision. What Pacific content do you currently use or share, and why? And if your answer is that you do not currently share any Pacific content, take a moment to reflect on that too. What has shaped that position for you? What experiences, opportunities, or gaps may have influenced where you are at this point in your journey? These questions are designed to support thoughtful reflection and to help you identify that this learning might open up for you as you continue through the module. Now we turn to foundational knowledge on the Pacific. You'll see here a map of the Pacific Ocean with the Pacific Island countries and territories outlined, but with no names. Pause the video and click on the link below on the Canvas page titled Pacific Geography Quiz to test your knowledge of the region, and once you've completed the quiz, come back to the video. How did you go? For many of us, an exercise like this highlights just how vast the Pacific region really is. It helps us begin to place names, locations, and relationships across Oceania, and it reminds us that learning the region takes time, curiosity, and ongoing engagement. It is also important to remember that the way Pacific Island countries and territories are framed today has been shaped by relatively recent histories and political processes. As Damon Salesa reminds us, nation-states are never simply natural formations. They emerge through history, circumstance, and the interaction of local and global forces. For example, one of the most familiar ways of dividing Oceania is into three regions of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. These labels were introduced in 1832 by French naval commander and naturalist Dumont d'Urville. They were based on a Eurocentric reading of Oceania, its peoples, and its cultures. The name themselves translate as Polynesia, meaning many islands, Micronesia, meaning little islands, and Melanesia, meaning dark islands. Over time, these labels have shaped how the region is understood. They brought some peoples and places together within shared categories, while also separating others in ways that can flatten the richness and diversity of Pacific cultures, languages, and histories. Even so, these terms have become deeply embedded and are still widely used in geographical reference points. That is why it is helpful to approach them thoughtfully, to understand where they come from, what they have meant, and how they continue to shape ways Oceania is imagined and discussed. Now that we have a clearer sense of the contemporary landscape, we can begin to shift our focus to a longer view of the peoples of the Pacific. Over the past 50 years, understandings of Pacific history have deepened in important ways through the revival of oral histories, Indigenous Pacific knowledge systems, and ongoing developments in science and technology. When Europeans first encountered Pacific peoples, they struggled to grasp the depth of knowledge, skill, and technology that supported complex societies across Oceania. This is relative to Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. Following contact, much knowledge was affected by the devastating loss of life through introduced disease, along with colonial practices that diminished Indigenous histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures. Even so, many of these histories continue to be reclaimed, remembered, and shared. Current thinking often points to three major movements across the Pacific: the settlement of Australia and New Guinea, the settlement of Near Oceania, and later the movement into remote Oceania. Across these long histories, Pacific peoples adapted to changing environments and developed rich cultures with deep relationships to land, sea, and each other. It is important to remember that Pacific histories are diverse, layered, and held in many places. Our aim is not to search for a single story, but to recognize the many narratives that emerge from different peoples, places, and knowledge traditions. As you move through the resource provided, take your time, reflect on what stands out for you, and note ideas that may support your own learning and practice. Welcome back. We hope that video helped bring the history of the Pacific into clearer view, showing the depth of human engagement with the region across thousands of years. It offered a brief insight into an Indigenous past shaped by innovation, movement, and the growth of complex and diverse peoples, languages, and cultures grounded in an oceanic worldview. To guide this topic, we begin with the words of Mawalei Vau Albert Wendt, who reminds us, quote, "We are what we remember," close quote. This speaks to the importance of memory, story, and identity in shaping how Pacific peoples understand themselves and their histories. We also turn to Salesa, who writes, quote, "It is not merely what we remember, but also how we remember that matters," close quote. His work invites us to think critically about Pacific history through a Pacific lens and to consider how understandings of past continue to shape the present. A key point in Salesa's work is that Pacific peoples must be centered in their own histories. Pacific peoples are not passive subjects with someone else's account. They're active agents, narrators, navigators, and knowledge holders who carry and interpret their own stories. Building on the work of scholars such as Apeli Hauofa and Albert Wendt, Salesa also helps us understand that the ocean is a space of connection. The Pacific Ocean is not an empty distance between islands. It is a network of relationships, movement, knowledge, and exchange that has long connected Pacific peoples across Oceania. Pacific history is also interdisciplinary. It is held through oral traditions, storytelling, archaeology, linguistics, environmental knowledge, and embodied cultural practices. Knowledge is passed intergenerationally and carried through people, place, ceremony, and memory. This matters because colonial histories have often flattened or distorted Pacific narratives, and Salesa calls for a reclaiming of Indigenous time and memory so that Pacific histories can be told on their own terms. So as you continue through this topic, we invite you to stay attentive to these ideas. Think about what it means to remember, how histories are shaped, and how Pacific peoples continue to narrate and carry their own stories. Consider too what this asks of us in research, in teaching and supervision, and the relationships we build across the university and beyond. In this next part, we're going to go a little deeper into Salesa's framing of the Pacific and Indigenous time. As you move through this section, you can pause the video at any point to return to the book chapter linked in the Canvas page. One of the important points Salesa makes is that the Pacific is deeply diverse. As he reminds us, the diversity of Indigenous peoples means that there can be no single way of experiencing the present and no single way of representing the past. This is a helpful starting point because it encourages us to stay open to the many different ways history, time, memory, and identity are understood across Oceania. Salesa explains that Indigenous Pacific time has its own shape and logic. He describes it as beginning in a cosmological age of creation and divinity, moving into an age of culture heroes that gives form and meaning to the world, and then into genealogical times where the present is connected to the past through the ancestors of the living. In this framing, time is relational, cyclical, and grounded in genealogy. Genealogy connects the natural and supernatural worlds, and it helps orient people not only to the past but also to ancestors, descendants, and living relationships. Time in this sense is not measured only through an external system or a fixed calendar. It is carried through people, lineage, memory, story, and connection. This is one of Salesa's key contributions. He argues that Indigenous Pacific time is not simply a smaller part of a Western historical timeline. It is a dimension of its own. That is important because it helps us recognize that Pacific ways of understanding time are intellectually rich, coherent, and grounded in their own philosophical traditions. Salesa gives the example of European contact in the Tuamotus, where Europeans asked Indigenous people to draw their universe. What was drawn reflected a Polynesian understanding of the world as layered, relational, and interconnected. It included multiple dimensions, heavens and underworlds, spaces that could be traversed by particular beings, ancestors, or sacred persons. Within this view, ancestral worlds and present worlds remain connected. Relationships and genealogies hold together past, present, and future. Leadership, too, was often understood as sacred through genealogical connections to ancestors. In this way, ancestors are not simply figures of a distant past. They remain present in meaningful ways, connected to life now, though not always in the same visible or physical plane. What emerges here is a worldview in which all things are connected. Time is alive with relationship. The past is carried into present, and the present is always in conversation with those who came before and those yet to come. As you listen and reflect, think about what this understanding of time opens up. Consider how it might shift the way we approach history. research and our teaching and the kinds of knowledge we recognise and value. Salesa continues by drawing our attention to the importance of genealogy in Indigenous Pacific life. As he writes, genealogies, not states, framed Indigenous Pacific lives and archive families and lineages. This is a powerful reminder that identity, belonging, memory, and authority have long been held through relationships of descent, kinship, and connection, rather than through the kinds of political structures that often dominate Western understandings of history. And he also reminds us that genealogies are rarely simple or purely secular. They can be layered, elusive, protected, and deeply political, with real significance in the present. Genealogies carry meaning, status, and responsibility and connection, and they often shape how people understand themselves in relation to others, to ancestors, and to place. Importantly, genealogy cannot easily be separated from the places where Pacific peoples have lived their lives. Land, ocean, ancestry, and memory are deeply interconnected, and in this sense, genealogy is not only about who someone comes from, it is also about where they are from, the worlds they belong to, and the relationships that hold these worlds together. The widely shared Polynesian concept of va or wa, or vaha'a, is especially important for understanding Polynesian ideas of time. These concepts speak not only to time, but also to space, and often to relationship as well. They help us understand time and space as connected as a kind of relational space-time dynamic. This way of thinking is not about standing still at a fixed point. It is about movement and the connection and the possibility of moving between people, places, times, and dimensions. In this framing, relationships are central. Time is lived through connection, and space is never empty. It is full of meaning, presence, and relational depth. And as you reflect on this, consider what genealogy means in Pacific context, beyond a family tree. Think about it as a living archive of relationships and responsibilities, and memory and belonging, and as something that helps hold together time, space, and the many dimensions of Pacific life. Pacific research is a broad descriptor that encompasses various approaches to research. AUT's Moana Roa Pacific Research Guidelines state, the primary role of Pacific research is to generate knowledge and understanding about and for Pacific peoples and their environments, with their active involvement as researchers, community leaders, advisors, participants, and stakeholders. The Pacific research design approach moves away from outsider perspectives towards Indigenous interpretations, aiming to be empowering for both researchers and the researched. Close quote. As such, Pacific research reflects and incorporates Pacific values, knowledge systems, and aspirations through practices that are relational, reciprocal, and woven through ongoing ties to community, place, and ancestral knowledge. A key aspect of Pacific Indigenous research, and Indigenous research approaches generally, challenge a single uniform way of knowing, studying, or representing the Pacific. Instead, it is characterized by diversity, drawing from multiple disciplines: anthropology, history, sociology, linguistics, literature, climate change, Indigenous studies, etc., and a diverse range of cultures, languages, and histories. It is characterized by cultural pluralism. Pacific people themselves are not a single homogeneous group. The region encompasses thousands of islands, hundreds of cultures and languages, and varied political and colonial histories. Pacific research must therefore make space for many voices: Indigenous, diasporic, feminist, youth, and community-based, rather than privileging one authoritative view. It is dynamic and context-specific. What counts as valid knowledge in one island context may not apply in another. For example, Vanua, land, in Fiji, Whanua, land in Tonga, Whenua, land in Aotearoa, is all theorized differently. Even though these concepts are related, research questions, ethics, and outputs must respond to local needs and not assume a universal Pacific identity or condition. It is resistant to reductionism. Historically, colonial scholarship portrayed the Pacific in monolithic terms, as small, isolated islands, as a paradise, or dependent states. Hau'ofa and others challenge this by insisting on complexity, interconnectedness, and agency, saying Pacific research is not monolithic, and it resists those stereotypes and emphasizes intellectual diversity and sovereignty. So in practice, this means no single theory or framework fully explains Pacific realities, and researchers must avoid overgeneralizing or treating the Pacific as a single entity. Collaborative, context-sensitive, and plural approaches are valued. There is a list of key readings here on the slide to support your understanding of the epistemic complexities of Pacific research. In this section, we turn to the timeline of the Pacific research movement. This part is guided especially by the work of Here Niko in his chapter, Representations of Cultural Identities, along with other scholarship that helps us think more deeply about Pacific knowledge, identity, and history. At any point, you're welcome to pause the video and return to the reading, or spend time with other resources that are available to you on Canvas. So before European contact, Pacific approaches to knowledge making were already sophisticated, deeply grounded and woven through cultural, environmental, and spiritual life of each community. Now, these approaches may not have been described as research in the Western academic sense, but they were clearly rich systems of inquiry, observation, interpretation, and knowledge creation. They were indeed holistic, relational, and shaped by purpose. Now, a central part of this knowledge making was genealogy and relationship. Across many Pacific contexts, knowledge was understood through connections to ancestors, kin, land, sea, and the wider cosmos. Inquiry often began with understanding one's place in the world and one's responsibilities within it. This meant that knowledge was not separated from relationships, it was generated through them, carried through them, and made meaningful through them. Pacific peoples were also highly skilled observers of the natural world. Through long periods of close and careful observation, communities developed deep understandings of weather patterns, ocean currents, stars, animal behavior, and plant cycles. This knowledge supported navigation, agriculture, fishing, healing, and seasonal planning, and it was practical, precise, and grounded in generations of experience. It was also adaptive, responding to environmental change and local conditions over time. Knowledge was preserved and shared through oral and performative forms, such as storytelling, chants, songs, dance, ceremony, and many other forms of oral transmission, and these carried complex systems of meaning across generations. These were not simply cultural expressions in a narrow sense, they were also archives of knowledge. Within them are histories, genealogies, navigational knowledge, ecological understandings, spiritual teaching, and ways of living well in relation to others and the environment. Importantly, knowledge creation in Pacific context was purposeful and community-centered. It was not generated for abstraction alone. It was intended to serve the well-being, continuity, and flourishing of the collective. Knowledge helped communities find new islands, to understand seasonal cycles, to care for the environment, to heal illness, maintain relationships, and sustain life. So in this sense, knowledge making was always connected to use, responsibility, and relevance. It was also inseparable from spirituality and cosmology. Inquiry was not treated as separate from sacred life. Knowledge was often understood as carrying spiritual significance, and its transmission and use were guided by ritual, by protocol, and sacred restrictions. This meant that knowledge had ethical dimensions, held with care, and access to it was shaped by role, responsibility, and relational accountability. So another important feature of this phase was its intergenerational character. Knowledge was passed from elders to younger generations through observation, through guidance, participation, and experience. So apprenticeship was a common form of learning, especially in areas as navigation, healing, carving, and ceremony. Learning happened through doing, through listening, through being present, and through growing into knowledge over time. As Here Niko suggests, this phase of Pacific history gave rise to some of the most dynamic and imaginative cultural forms in the region. It reflects a time of strong efforts to understand the universe, a deep engagement with spiritual life, and ongoing movements of peoples across the ocean. It was also a time of exchange where ideas, practices, and knowledge moved between communities and contributed to making of island identities and ways of understanding the world. What this reminds us is that Pacific knowledge systems have long been rigorous, long been creative and expansive. They have always involved inquiry, interpretation, and the careful building of knowledge. They have also been tied to people, to place, purpose, and continuity. As we move through the timeline of the Pacific Research Movement, it is important to begin here with the recognition that Pacific peoples were already generating, holding, and transmitting complex knowledge long before European contact. As you continue, you might reflect on what counts as research, who gets to define it, and how Pacific knowledge traditions invite us to think more broadly and more carefully about the many ways knowledge is made and carried. As Europeans began arriving in the Pacific in sailing ships carrying guns, disease, iron tools, and unfamiliar ideas, Pacific life changed rapidly. This was a period of immense disruption, and it was also a time when Pacific peoples responded with adaptability, strategy, resilience, and innovation in order to survive and protect their worlds. In the early phases of European contact, much of the mapping in the Pacific was driven by commercial goals. By the 18th century, Western scientific and commercial exploration had increased dramatically. During this time, some Europeans imagined the Pacific through the ideal of the so-called noble savage, seeing it as a place where humanity and nature could be observed in a world they believed to be untouched by civilization. Missionary and colonial influence increasingly recast Pacific peoples as uncivilized, heathen, and in need of reform. These ideas were used to justify intervention into Pacific societies, belief systems, governance, and everyday life. Even within these changing conditions, Pacific peoples were not passive. They were active agents in these encounters. And across the region, Pacific leaders and communities hosted, observed, traded with, and engaged missionaries, merchants, and other newcomers with care and strategic intent. Some also sent representatives aboard to learn more about the people who had arrived on their shores, and these journeys created opportunities to gather knowledge, form alliances, negotiate power, and understand new technologies and political systems. There are many important examples of this across the region. Tahiti, Tonga, Hawaii, Aotearoa, and others all had significant engagements with the Europeans. One well-known example is Mai or Mai from Raiatea, who travelled to England with Captain Cook in the 1770s. His journey was far more than a curiosity for the British audience. It also became a way for Pacific leaders to gain insight into European power and influence. In Aotearoa, Ngāpuhi leaders such as Hongihika and Ruatara travelled to Australia in search of trade opportunities and wider knowledge. In Tonga, Tupou I gathered chiefs in 1859 to begin drafting the kingdom's first law code, which was issued in 1862 and later oversaw the 1875 constitution. That formalised the monarchy, protected land rights, and established a parliamentary system. Across the Pacific, Indigenous communities also adapted new forms of knowledge and technology in selective and strategic ways. Christianity was often woven into local cosmologies, producing forms of belief that reflected both continuity and change. Literacy was also used in powerful ways to write laws, petitions, and histories that asserted Indigenous rights and sovereignty. At the same time, oral traditions continued, allowing communities to maintain knowledge through both spoken and written forms. Even so, Pacific communities were facing forces of extraordinary scale. Indigenous Pacific approaches could and did adapt, but the combined pressure of disease, weapons, foreign technologies, and colonial systems had devastating consequences. This period is often understood through the influence of the 3 M's: military, missionary, and merchants. So, military power imposed foreign and political governance structures. Missionaries introduced education systems alongside spiritual and cultural regulation, and merchants pursued trade, resource extraction, and influence over legal and economic systems. So together these forces reshaped Pacific societies in profound ways. As Harineko observes, Christianity and Western capitalism worked powerfully together in this period. From the arrival of missionaries through to the Second World War, many Pacific peoples were taught to emulate the dress, language, behaviour, and customs of the colonizers. Missionary education was deeply tied to the project of civilizing Pacific people and separating them from their own cultural foundations. So for many communities, this brought deep loss, including the erosion of dignity, pride, language, and cultural continuity. As we reflect on this part of the timeline, it is important to hold both realities together. This was a period of colonial disruption and harm, and it was also a period in which Pacific peoples continued to act with strategy, with intelligence and resilience. Their responses were never simply about receiving change. They were also about reading it, about negotiating it, and adapting to it, and in many cases resisting it. The colonisation of the Pacific and Aotearoa New Zealand's role within that history are both vast and complex topics. There is a great deal to explore, and this section offers only a brief entry point into some of the wider histories of power, control, and political change across the region. Across the 20th century, control of many Pacific islands and territories shifted from one colonising power to another. As you will see in the map, colonial authority in the Pacific has changed over time with different imperial powers, shaping the political landscape of the region in different periods and in different ways. To support your learning in this area, we've provided a couple of resources for you to spend time with more closely, and we invite you to pause the video here and engage with them at your own pace. The first is the Aotearoa History Show, Season 2, Episode 14, on NZ's Pacific Empire from RNZ. And the second is Damon Celes's chapter, New Zealand's Pacific, from the New Oxford History of New Zealand. Together, these resources will help deepen your understanding of the colonisation of the Pacific and Aotearoa's New Zealand's place within those histories. In this next part of the timeline, we begin to see major political and educational shifts taking place across the Pacific. The status of many Pacific nations changed significantly as movements toward independence gathered momentum. On the next slide, you'll see a table that helps map some of these transitions more clearly. At the same time, Western education systems were becoming more firmly established across the region. These systems shaped how knowledge was organised, taught and valued, and they became increasingly influential in public life, governance and administration. During this period, Pacific research from a Western lens was often seen as important for the effective administration of Pacific territories and the control of resources by global powers. Research was used to inform governance, policy and strategic interests in the region, and this shaped the kinds of questions that were asked and the kinds of knowledge that was prioritised. It was also during this time that the United States launched an intensive area studies project, which contributed to the establishment of the first Pacific Studies program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the Pacific Island Studies program. This marked an important moment in the formal academic study of the Pacific within university settings, although much of that early work was still influenced by external geopolitical and institutional interests. Alongside this, Pacific research from an Indigenous Pacific lens was beginning to take shape in ways that were deeply connected to cultural reconstruction, sovereignty and self-determination. As Pacific nations moved closer to independence, there was a growing need for scholarship that could support these transitions, affirm Pacific identities, and contribute to political and cultural renewal. A major milestone in this journey was the establishment of the University of the South Pacific in 1968 in Suva, Fiji. The university was created to provide higher education and training for the peoples of the Pacific Islands, and it was widely understood as an important step toward the autonomy of Pacific nations during the later stages of colonial rule. As Hidden Nickel reminds us, university education, whether gained overseas or at home, helped restore pride and build confidence among Pacific peoples, and it gave many the tools to challenge injustice, to write back against colonial power, and to push for political and cultural independence. Through writing, scholarship and education, Pacific peoples increasingly asserted their voices, their own critiques and their own aspirations for the future. What emerges in this period is a powerful shift. Education and research were no longer only tools of the colonial administration. They're also becoming tools for Pacific self-definition, resistance and transformation. This slide here depicts the changing status of Pacific nations and territories post-World War II. There is no one Pacific story to be told. Each nation, each territory would experience this process in unique ways. To engage in Pacific research, one should take a deep dive into the particular context of the area being researched and come to learn the many stories from that context. We begin this section with a quote by Epeli Hau'ofa, whose scholarship, creativity and activism shape how the Pacific sees itself and how the world sees it. His legacy continues to inspire cultural revival, academic innovation and region-wide solidarity, and frames the approach to the AUT's Pacific Research Guidelines. His essay, Our Sea of Islands, is one of the most quoted pieces of academic literature in Pacific research. To frame our understanding, we ask you to pause the video at this point and read Hau'ofa's Our Sea of Islands. We invite you to pause the video at this time and read this powerful work. In this next phase of the timeline, decolonisation and Indigenous resurgence become major forces shaping Pacific research. This is an important turning point because Pacific research begins to move more clearly away from colonial control and toward Pacific self-determination. At the heart of this shift is a strong desire to reclaim how knowledge is produced, whose knowledge is valued, and who has the authority to speak, interpret, and lead research in Pacific contexts. Now, this transformation was led by Pacific scholars across the arts, literature, philosophy, history, and education. Much of the writing of this period carried a strong anti-colonial and anti-European critique. It challenged the long history of research that had positioned Pacific peoples as objects of study, and it called instead for research that is grounded in Pacific values, Pacific priorities, and Pacific ways of knowing. One key development in this period is the reclaiming of Pacific knowledge systems. Pacific research increasingly shifted from being conducted on Pacific peoples to being led by Pacific scholars themselves. This meant drawing on Indigenous Pacific epistemologies and developing methodologies that were culturally grounded and respectful. Frameworks such as Kakala, Waka Te Olewā, and Tiwaiwai emerged as important examples. These methodologies centre relationality, reciprocity, respect, and accountability to community. A second key development is the challenge to Western research paradigms. Pacific scholars began openly critiquing the dominance of Western models of research and questioning the assumptions, ethics, and power relations that shape them. In their place, they called for research approaches that are ethical, community-driven, and responsive to Pacific realities. This opens space for post-development thinking, counter-hegemonic practice, and protocols grounded in relationships and cultural care. A third important shift is institutional and global recognition. Over time, Pacific research methodologies became more visible within university curricula, research frameworks, funding systems, and policy development, especially in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, these approaches are now increasingly recognised internationally as rigorous and valid in their own right. They're no longer seen as marginal alternatives, but as intellectually rich and deeply relevant frameworks for research and knowledge-making. As Hedoneko notes, the University of the South Pacific played an important role in this movement by bringing emerging Pacific leaders into contact with one another, and through the influence of major thinkers such as Albert Wendt, Marjorie Tuanei Kore Crocombe, Billy Hau'ofa, Kornaihilu Tharman, Pio Manoa, and Raymond Pillai, the university became a significant site for imaginative literature, cultural expression, and intellectual exchange. This period also saw the strengthening of regional Pacific identity. One important example is the Pacific Way, a concept developed by Ratu Sir Kimisese Mara, the first Prime Minister of Fiji, and he first introduced it in a speech at the United Nations in 1970. The Pacific Way became a symbol of regional cooperation and identity among Pacific Island nations. It expressed a shared Pacific orientation grounded in common cultural values and collective relationships. At the same time, this period also brought important reflection on education. Hedoneko points out that Western education could create distance from land, culture, and community, and for many Pacific people who studied overseas that returned home found a need to reconnect, to relearn cultural knowledge and traditional skills, and to reclaim an Indigenous sense of identity and belonging. This reminds us that education can be both enabling and dislocating, and that cultural reconnection has been an important part of Pacific resurgence. Taken together, these developments show that decolonisation and Indigenous resurgence reshape Pacific research in profound ways. Pacific research became a space for reclaiming knowledge systems, challenging colonial dominance, strengthening cultural identity, and building forms of scholarship that serve Pacific peoples on Pacific terms. This era had a profound and lasting impact on Pacific communities in Aotearoa and across the oceanic region. As the New Zealand economy slowed in the 1970s, Pacific peoples faced increasing unemployment and racialised scrutiny. Discriminatory policies and government-supported narratives wrongfully cast Pacific migrants as overstayers and a threat to local employment, despite most overstaying at the time were from Europe and North America. This hostility culminated in the infamous Dawn Raids, where Pacific families were subjected to early morning raids by immigration officials and police, often using intimidation and racial profiling to enforce deportations. The lasting trauma and injustices of this era have only recently been formally acknowledged, with the Crown issuing an official apology in 2021. This history remains a critical context for understanding the experiences of Pacific peoples in Aotearoa today. The next 3 slides highlight a few of the influential Pacific scholars who laid the groundwork for our present work. These are just a few that may help you better understand that movement. We invite you to explore their work and learn more about their stories. We are reminded here by the Samoan proverb, "E le uma le ngaluenga e whaipea." The work is not finished, it continues. This is a fitting way to think about Pacific research today. It reminds us that this field is ongoing, it is relational and collective. It is work that carries forward across generations, and it calls each of us to consider what we're contributing to the future. As Leali'i whanau Professor Albert Rafiti observes, much of the archival work produced up until around the year 2000 was created mainly by outsiders. He reminds us that we now carry a responsibility to create new archives for the future. That is a powerful challenge, and it asks us to think about who is producing knowledge, whose voices are being recorded, and what forms of knowledge we are preserving for those who come after us. This is also part of the intent behind Wānaroa's Pacific Research Guidelines. The purpose of the guidelines is to support the further development of research practices that contribute to improving the lives of Pacific peoples, while also promoting and sustaining Pacific excellence in knowledge generation and preservation. In other words, Pacific research is not only about producing scholarship, it is also about ensuring that research serves Pacific communities in meaningful and life-affirming ways. At the same time, it is important to recognise that much Pacific scholarship in Aotearoa has often focused on dominant Pacific ethnic groups, especially those most visible through population size and colonial history. Moanaroa takes a wider view. It is a home for Pacific research and researchers from a broad range of Indigenous communities across the Pacific Rim. In this way, the guidelines contribute to a wider Pacific scholarly conversation in Aotearoa, while also positioning that conversation within the region and internationally. A key point to understand here is that Western academic traditions have often framed the Pacific in limited ways as isolated, primitive, or dependent. Now, these framings have ignored the rich histories of Pacific navigation, exchange, philosophy, and relational knowledge systems. Pacific people have long held sophisticated intellectual traditions, and those traditions continue to shape how research can be imagined and practiced today. This is where foundational Indigenous scholarship becomes important. Henry and Bene help us think carefully about the philosophical paradigms that guide Indigenous research design and methodology. When we apply this to Pacific research, we're invited to ask some very important questions. What is real for Pacific peoples? What is true according to Pacific practices and protocols? What is of value in Pacific knowledge and inquiry? These are questions of ontology, epistemology, and axiology. They shape not only Pacific methodologies, but also how we understand knowledge itself, including what counts as science and how inquiry is carried out. Diggio also reminds us that one of the common experiences of Indigenous peoples in the Pacific is that outsiders have often dismissed or overlooked the fact that Pacific cultures have their own philosophies. In many cases, this dismissal happened because Pacific knowledge was held orally rather than in written form. Yet philosophy existed long before literacy. This is an important reminder that written knowledge is only one form of knowledge, and it should never be treated as the only legitimate one. Now, related to this, Violetti cautions that standardized research tools, even when they appear methodologically sound, can fall short when they do not reflect the lived realities, values, and ways of being of Pacific peoples. Research tools and methods may be consistent on paper, yet still fail to engage meaningfully with Pacific life. This leads us to another important concept raised by Henry and Penny and later taken up by Brunner, which is epistemic violence. Epistemic violence refers to the harm that happens when systems of knowledge silence, marginalize, or misinterpret particular peoples, especially those who have experienced colonization. When one knowledge system claims universal authority across all cultures, places, and histories, it can erase other ways of knowing and being. This is why it is so important to critically engage with and privilege Pacific knowledge systems and methodologies. Pacific research needs to be culturally grounded. It needs to be relational and reflective of Pacific ways of knowing and being. It needs to honor Pacific philosophies, the protocols and values, and needs to support knowledge practices that are accountable to Pacific communities. Now, as you reflect on this section, you might consider what it means to create new archives for the future, what kinds of knowledge are being valued in your own work, and how Pacific research can continue to strengthen community, identity, and collective well-being. In the context of Pacific research, indigeneity goes beyond ethnic or geographic identifiers and is a lived and relational condition rooted in genealogical connections, ngafa, tupuanga, akaapapa, to sacred lands, whanua, vanua, enua, the waters and skies. It is expressed through responsibilities of care, of stewardship and reciprocity towards people and the environment, interwoven with spirituality and cultural continuity. In Pacific research, indigeneity requires methodologies grounded in Pacific epistemologies, in the collective well-being, ensuring relational accountability and service to the community rather than extraction. Pacific Indigenous knowledge systems are embodied in language, oral traditions, customary practices, performance, spiritual beliefs, and environmental stewardship. These systems are not static in the homelands they originate from, nor are they static in the diasporic communities. They adapt to disparate realities while retaining cultural integrity. In Aotearoa, Pacific diasporic communities enact their knowledge systems in churches and village, in island associations, cultural festivals, networks, talanoa, and intergenerational teaching and learning spaces, among many others. In this sense, diasporic contributions to Pacific research are not a rupture of Indigenous knowledge, but an expansion of its relational geography. For Pacific research in the diaspora, acknowledging these knowledge systems means recognizing their dynamic nature and ensuring research processes honor both the continuities and innovations that diasporic life brings. In these guidelines, the term Pacific peoples is used inclusively to refer to Pacific communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the wider Pacific region, and diasporic communities globally with ancestral ties to the Pacific Islands or Moananui-a-Kiwa. The term Pacific does not represent a single identity, but a constellation of unique yet interconnected cultures, languages, and knowledge systems. Now, for this reason, a unified framework can be difficult to achieve. Even so, there are a variety of Pacific identities among the Pacific diaspora that need to be considered. For example, New Zealand-born, island-born, multi-ethnic. The term Pacific peoples is the recommended term used in Aotearoa, New Zealand, though other terms such as Pacifica, Pacificans, and Pacific Islanders have been historically used interchangeably. More recent waves of migration, particularly from the 1950s to 1970s, were shaped by New Zealand's post-war industrial expansion. Pacific peoples, primarily from Polynesian nations, were actively recruited by the New Zealand government to help meet labour shortages. This migration laid the foundation for strong cultural, economic and political relationships between Pacific communities and Aotearoa. The New Zealand government defines Pacific populations as encompassing over 18 diverse ethnic groups in Aotearoa, New Zealand. These include, in order of population size, Samoan, Tongan, Cook Islands Māori, Niuean, Fijian, Tokelauan, Tuvaluan, Kiribati, Tahitian, Papua New Guinean, New Vanuatu, Rotuman, Indigenous Australian, Solomon Islander, Hawaiian, Pitcairn Islander, Nauruan, and other. Each possess their own distinct languages, cultures, and unique migration and settlement histories. A significant proportion, 43% of Pacific peoples identified with two or more ethnicities in the 2023 census data. This figure rose to 62% for Pacific peoples under 15 years, highlighting mixed ethnic generations within this group. 21% of Pacific peoples also identified as Māori, while 11% of Māori also identified as Pacific peoples. Māori Pacific peoples are a small but fast-growing group in Aotearoa, with nearly 5% of all children under 15 identifying as Māori Pacific. As we come to the end of this module, we recognise that it brings together a lifetime of learning. The Pacific research movement across its past, present and future is vast, it's layered and deeply significant. Our hope is that this topic has offered you a meaningful introduction and opened up some new ways of thinking about Pacific research, its histories and its possibilities. At this point, we invite you to pause the video and take some time to note down your thoughts, your key learnings and any areas you'd like to explore further. Now, to support that process, we've provided a few reflective questions to help you sit with the material and consider what it might mean in your own context. One activity we encourage is to create a summary of key insights you have gained from this topic on the Pacific research movement. You might do this in a way that feels creative and useful for you. It could be a mind map, a visual summary, a short poem, a set of key themes, or another kind of memory tool that helps bring your learning together. We also encourage you to identify any resources that you'd like to explore more deeply, especially those that connect directly to your own work and context. From there, we ask you to reflect on these questions. How can your research, teaching and learning or supervision better serve Pacific community needs, priorities and aspirations? And who can you consult with to support that alignment? What resources, whether knowledge holders, literature, community relationships, or other supports might help strengthen that work? These questions are intended to help you move from reflection into application and to think carefully about how Pacific research can be carried forward in ways that are relational, community grounded and responsive to the people it seeks to serve. We hope you found this module as a useful introduction to the Pacific Research Guidelines. Our next topic will focus on positionality, relationality, and reflexivity, asking you to articulate the significance of positionality, relationality, and reflexivity in Pacific research, supervision, and teaching and learning. Reflect on your own positionality and relational connections to Pacific communities, places, and knowledge systems, and consider how these influence your research, teaching, and supervision practices. We'd like to warmly acknowledge the contributors to this module, Dr. Jessica Wirtschel, our learning module designer. We also acknowledge the AUT Moanaro Governance Group, the Moanaro Pacific Research Guidelines Working Group, led by Dr. Daisha Tunimopea, and our ROs Claralyn and Waverley for their valuable contributions. Our thanks also to the creative designers, Cece and Kayani, who are both AUT alumni, for helping bring this module to life. You can reach out to me if you need any further support, and you can also access Pacific research resources through the Moanaro website. Thank you so much for your engagement in these learning modules, and I wish you all the best with your journey through Pacific research.